Suppose you came to a country where you could fill an entire theater by simply bringing a covered plate out onto stage, and then slowly lifting the cover so as everyone could see, just before the lights went out, that it contained a mutton chop or a bit of bacon. Would you not think that in that country something had gone wrong with the appetite for food? C.S. Lewis wrote that in the 1940s. I think he might be onto something. I think maybe our appetite for sex has gone a little wrong. Pretty much any way you look at it, our culture is preoccupied with sex way beyond its actual significance. Some old people will tell you that this is a new development, but I don't think so. I think they probably just weren't paying attention when it happened a long time ago. People like us have grown up largely unprotected from what grown-ups cynically refer to as adult content. We never really knew a world without blatant sexual language on pop radio, easy access to restricted movie rentals, cable TV, and one-click access to things on the internet that would get our grandfathers thrown out of the house, maybe even put in prison. We never knew a world without HIV/AIDS and sexually transmitted infections. But we didn't introduce all that to the sexual equation. It was there when we arrived. Telling us how much things have changed for the worse is like telling a porpoise that the ocean used to be a much nicer place to live. There just really isn't much he can do with that information, is there? And besides, the news is not all bad. Teen pregnancies are at a record low. A girl today is much less likely to be raped than when my mom was in school. But it's not all good either. We do have that sexual preoccupation thing going on. Pornography is very easy to find and incredibly hard to kick. Pregnancies are down, but there's still a lot of hooking up going on, and a lot of sexual experimentation, and a lot of sexual identity confusion. In the middle of all this sits a group of people who believe, well, hope, that the story about humans being created in God's image is true, and that our Creator has something positive to say about making us sexual by nature. I know people who think this is sentimental, others who think it's just flat out ridiculous, which is fine, because I'm beginning to suspect that what the Bible has to say about sex may be more useful than ever. People tend to think that the Bible is hopelessly naive about modern sex. It's not. The earliest Christian communities thrived in cultures where sexual norms were flat out abusive, places where sexual slavery was a given. They lived in cultures where women were treated like property, collected, traded, used, and discarded. They lived in cities where young boys were treated as sex objects by wealthy men, and no one raised an eyebrow, let alone a helping hand. People who loved Jesus stood out in those cultures, not so much because of what they said, but because of how they lived. They reinvented the family by introducing committed marriage, respecting women, and nurturing and protecting children instead of exploiting them. These changes were huge. Think of what we know about sexual abuse. Most abusers were themselves victims of abuse when they were young. There's every reason to believe that it's always been this way, which means that adult believers who were abused as children chose to break the cycle of abuse. They chose to give better than they got. Adult believers chose to treat their wives as partners instead of property. People who grew up one way chose to live another way by the power of God's Spirit, so that children weren't disposable, marriages weren't temporary, and sex wasn't violent. These changes were huge. Not because smart people wrote about them, but because ordinary people lived them out every day. I wonder if it's time to do that again. Somehow the church has lost the thread of sexual wholeness. We talk a good game, but nobody's really listening, because actions speak louder than words. I've seen it in my own family. Publicly, my father, the preacher, believed that Christians should hunker down and defend their little piece of turf. Privately, my father, the sex addict, got a young woman pregnant twice and broke up his marriage. So maybe it's time that we stop obsessing about other people's sex lives and instead help each other grow into our own sexuality, healthy and whole. I think we can do it with God's grace, not because we're better than anyone else, but because God is so very good.
So where do you learn about sex?
Sex is everywhere. There's sex on The Simpsons.
I read a lot of magazines, just like guy magazines and stuff. Just whatever I could find.
MTV.
MTV.
definitely HBO.
From my friends, my family, my school.
Well, I got the clean version from my parents, and then I got the dirty version from my friends and the older kids in school.
In 3rd grade, I had a lot of friends that are perverts.
Mostly from my parents, because they give me advice on what to do and what not to do.
I really didn't have like the talk with my father until I was like about 13.
Well, I got a book for Christmas and I forgot what it's called. It was just all about sex, and my parents would just like read this.
At school during sex ed.
So when I got to sex ed, I didn't learn anything.
You don't know everything once you start off in a sex ed class, unless you're a genius or something.
It was a really good book.
At church and stuff, people talking about saving themselves.
I don't have any answers. I go to homeschool.
My parents told me what to do, and the Bible tells me what to do and not to do.
You see it on the internet, on TV, that's saying it's okay for a guy and a woman and a woman to have intercourse with each other.
I had like a 90-year-old teacher, and well, she didn't really teach me anything but like woodies and stuff.
My parents had me when they were pretty young, so they can't like tell me not to do something that they did.